So good afternoon and welcome everyone to this event. This is a panel discussion with Irene Khan and Miloon Kothari on the question how to protect rights-based pathways to democracy and development. My name is Christine Lutranger. I'm the Executive Director of the Albert Hischman Centre on Democracy, the organizer of this event, and a partner in this initiative which is called the Geneva Democracy Week, which takes place these days and which is promoted by the Geneva Chancellery of State with a number of partner organizations, institutions, in order to convene debates, activities on democracy, democratic practices, and it's our great pleasure and honor to have our two guest speakers today, which I'm delighted to introduce. Dr. Irene Khan is the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression since the 1st of August 2020. She's also a distinguished fellow and a research associate here at the Geneva Graduate Institute and our center. Actually, her mandate of the Special Rapporteur was created by the Human Rights Council in 1993 to protect and promote freedom of opinion and expression offline and online in light of international human rights law and standards. Before her work in this context as a mandate holder, Dr. Khan was the Director General of the International Development Law Organization from 2012 to 2019. And before that, she was the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2001 to 2009. Irene Khan was awarded the Sydney Peace Prize in 2006 for her work to stop violence against women. Amongst others, she's the author of the book The Unheard Truth, Poverty and Human Rights. And in the context of her mandate as Special Rapporteur, she has published some key thematic reports, which I invite you to read. The latest one was published in June 2025 and presented to the Human Rights Council, and it's on freedom of expression and elections in the digital age. Then I have the pleasure to have our guest, Miloon Kothari, who is visiting professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and an independent expert on human rights and social policy based in Geneva and Delhi. He is the president of UPR Info, which is a non-profit NGO aiming to promote human rights through the Universal Periodic Review. In July 2021, Miloon Kothari was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as commissioner with the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. From 2000 to 2008, he was the first Special Rapporteur on adequate housing with the United Nations Human Rights Council. During his tenure as Special Rapporteur, he led the process that resulted in the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on Development-Based Evictions and Displacement, which is the current global operational human rights standard on the practice of forced evictions. From 2013 to 2014, he was appointed Dr. Martin Luther King Visiting Scholar at the MIT. And during his time there, he was actively involved in the development of the MIT Displacement Research and Action Network. So really, again, very pleased to have you both here today for this discussion, and I thank you very much for your time. And the goal of this discussion is also to have the possibility for an exchange with the audience. So we'll have a first round of discussion with the panelists, and we'll open the floor. And the starting point for the discussion is that democracy is not merely a system of governance. It's indispensable also for protecting individual rights, freedoms, and dignity. So in this discussion, I'd like to focus also the attention on the curtailment of rights in democratic societies and in efforts of resistance. So I would also like to have your analysis on how how do these processes reflect some longer-term trends which might have filtered upwards and become more visible now? So maybe to go through that, I'd like to first maybe go straight into the discussion on the link between human rights and democracy, actually. So, Irene, how do you see this relationship between democracy and human rights? And how do democratic systems guarantee this protection in a context where we also see formal democratic context where those rights are being undermined?
Well, democracy without rights would have sounded like an oxymoron, maybe a couple of decades ago. But I think rulers like Viktor Orban has taught us that there is such a thing called illiberal democracy. What democracy does for rights, rights also does for democracy. Democracy without rights is meaningless, because democracy is about people holding power to account. And what rights do, they give a framework for that power to be held accountable. They allow, people are entitled to claim rights from their governments. Governments have an obligation, the state has an obligation to deliver rights. So this is a kind of a part of the social contract, which makes democracy more than a system of governance. It makes democracy a system where people's interests are put first, and there is accountability. Unfortunately, reality, of course, is quite different from the theory, and that is why you now see what Orban calls illiberal democracy, what I call backsliding democracies. A lot of people call backsliding democracies because they have the democratic promise, but they don't keep the promise, and they break the promise. And that, of course, leads to huge problems, because then and they break the promise in many different ways by capturing institutions. Rule of law is at the heart of human rights. There can be no human rights without the rule of law, because then human rights just become paper promises. But in non-democratic systems, the rule of law is undermined. We've seen that happening in Hungary. We're seeing that happening in even countries like India, the world's largest democracy, where institutions are being eroded. We've seen it in my own country, Bangladesh, where there was an elected government that ruled for 15 years and hollowed out all the institutions and committed enormous atrocities. So this is a partnership between human rights and democracy both ways. And if one doesn't work, then the other suffers.
Thank you, Irene. Miloon, how do you see also the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights within this broader context?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think as a beginning, perhaps it's important for us to sort of, in summary, understand what are human rights. And I think the best way to start is, I'm just going to quote from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, where it says that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is the preamble of the UDHR. And Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. These are all very important words. Perhaps we'll develop them during this conversation. But I just want to sort of say that, in my understanding and my work over the decades, I think what I find very valuable is that the entire edifice of human rights is built on the preservation and upholding of people's dignity. And so the edifice of human rights is also significantly premised on the need to meet the needs of the most vulnerable first, who are the ones affected the most. So such a departure point for the realization of human rights is particularly urgent now, at a time when the world's most historically, economically discriminated communities are increasingly impacted by neoliberal economics, by conflict, so-called development policies, and the adverse impact of phenomena like land grabbing and climate change. So in a sense, the role of democracies is actually to uphold these rights, but what in my work as a civil society activist, as representing the UN in different capacities, what I find is that the human rights approach is a radical alternative that directly challenges injustice, exploitation, and discrimination of millions across the world. So upholding human rights, which is what is there before all of us, presents a direct and powerful challenge to the global hegemonic forces that seek to reduce people's rights to commodities. There's a lot of commodification, financialization, and seek to financialize what should be basic entitlements: water, land, housing, and so forth. And very powerful in the human rights paradigm is that it rests on foundational principles of non-discrimination, gender equality, public participation, and the right to redress from human rights violations. And these principles, actually, as we have found recently in the collective collaborative work between environment and human rights, these principles complement and reinforce environmental principles. So, for example, the right to free, prior, informed consent, which we'll also discuss, can be derived from international human rights law. And human rights are universal. This is very powerful. They are for everyone. All countries have obligations on them, and they're universal and apply to everyone across the world, regardless of their race, religion, or economic status. And also very important is when we see the work of civil society movements, when we see the work of people who are resisting all the hegemonic forces, we now notice that, we can clearly see that notions of solidarity, fraternity, cooperation, trust, the Ubuntu philosophy, they go beyond the predominantly individualistic approach that Western paradigms have been criticized for. And of course, these are increasingly acknowledged as cornerstones of an alternative radical worldview based on human rights. So I just wanted to start with that, and then we can...
Thanks to both of you. So if we go further into unpacking the different phenomena that we are observing, what do you identify as main obstacles to human rights-based democracy, both in the formal democratic spaces, but also in online and offline spaces of expressions and participation, Irene?
I think the theory of human rights is a very idealistic theory. There is no country in the world that has actually got an A+ in human rights, and unlikely to get one either. And that is where the problem starts. The ideal of human rights and then the reality of a world in which actually, whether you enjoy your rights or not, don't depend on your humanity or human dignity as it's supposed to, but actually on the power that you hold. And whether it's economic power, political power, or today, digital power. So that is what, if you're talking about obstacles and why it's not real, that is where, on the one hand, people are disillusioned about human rights. You would not be able to go out in the street and get people to vote for human rights because people don't believe in it. They have given up on it. It hasn't produced the results for them. And the ways in which the ideal of human rights has been manipulated or undermined has been through the economy, right from the beginning of maybe there was a small period when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, when you have both economic and social rights and civil and political rights in there. But shortly after that, the divide started between the West and the East, the Soviet bloc at that time. Economic and social rights being seen as part of political socialism, the system of socialism and civil and political rights as a Western liberal democratic system. And that has gone through, in theory. In practice, what has happened is that basically there has been a capture, first by business, big business, where they have captured the politicians, they've captured the institutions, and turned democracy around so that it does not work for people's welfare, dignity, equal rights. It actually works for economic growth. And so you create this huge system of inequality that has grown up, has been very destructive of the human rights regime or thinking. The second issue has been digital technology. And when I talked about Viktor Orban, why am I so obsessed with him? I'm obsessed with him because when I started looking at Hungary, I realized how he had created the perfect system of converting democracies into autocracies. And he started with the media. That the Media Act was the first thing that he adopted, his government adopted in 2010. And through that system, now in Hungary, you don't have independent media. Hungary is a member of the European Union, but there is no independent media, maybe one radio station and one print. All independent media is now online because that's the only place where they can safely broadcast from. And so you take over the information. And that is happening all over the place. We now have digital oligarchs, basically. Now, if you look back, how did social media start? It started as a democratic space. It was the one space where citizens would come together. Everyone had equal access to information, to produce information, or to receive information. Yes, everyone still has equal access in that sense, but there is manipulation taking place. So we do not even realize that we have lost our right to equality. So there is that. Now, of course, when you talk about what do people want, most people actually want a decent life. They want safety. They want a future for their children. And those things are now being manipulated in ways that we do not even understand. You take artificial intelligence. Yes, it will do a lot of good. You can already see in medical science and other places where data is being crunched in a way that has never been crunched before because of artificial intelligence, and all sorts of things are happening. But at the same time, that same artificial intelligence will put a lot of people out of business, out of work. It's the Luddite revolution, if you can talk about it, the movement coming back now with a vengeance. And are we prepared as human beings? Because I hold the mandate for freedom of opinion and expression. People understand expression. They don't understand opinion. Opinion is what is in your mind. And the reason why a right to opinion was set out in the human rights instruments, and it's an absolute right, which means nothing and no one can stop it, was because in those days, the drafters were thinking about re-education camps, the Soviet re-education camps. But today, it's not the re-education camps that control your mind. It's actually the algorithms. So things are happening in ways in which human rights system almost seems naive. It was made for a world in which leaders would be responsible, people would care for each other, and we would respect human dignity, and because we are all human beings, we would treat each other equally. But the real world has proven to be very, very tough. And that is the big threat now as to whether those of us who believe in human rights can get into that dirty war and turn it around, because even freedom of expression is being weaponized. If you hate speech is seen as censorship. If you restrict hate speech, the most powerful country in this world is telling us, if you restrict hate speech, then you're censoring speech. If you don't restrict hate speech, what happens? It is the minorities who get chilled, because they're the ones who are attacked. It's poor people who are attacked. So again, you see power coming into play, and this is why, for me, the most important role that human rights should play is accountability. But how do you get that system of accountability? Because the system of accountability actually comes out in practice through a system of governance. And that is where when democracy fails, human rights can't be protected.
Miloon, how do you see the role of institutions and of civil society, actually, including grassroots movements, to push for the enforcement of rights, and how could institutions be reformed to ensure the protection, the consistent protection of marginalized or vulnerable groups?
Well, actually, I don't see the global situation as that bleak, Irene. I mean, I think that, one of the, let's say, the common article of the two covenants on human rights say that people have a right to self-determination. They have a right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I think when we look around the world today, we see many groups, many social movements who are out there, who are actually pushing for this. Some of them are achieving it. I can think of the farmers' movement in India or the land rights movement, and the peasants' movement in different parts of the world. And I think that we don't very often focus on those. And one of the main sort of benefits of those kind of movements is that they're pursuing what can be called, there was a big sort of movement in India in the 80s called the non-party political movement, essentially saying that we need to move away from formal parties and formal institutions to create our own politics. So in a sense, that is what social movements are doing. But what I see as the danger, and in this I would support what Irene was saying, is that there is a very sort of debilitating disconnect between what people are doing on the ground, the sort of civil disobedience that so many people are engaged in. And you can see that with the protests to support Palestine all over the world. You can see entire countries being shut down, like Italy these days. But there is a disconnect between those people who are actually fighting for human rights. They're using human rights language. And the political leadership. And this has been sort of very blatantly exposed with the situation that we've seen since October 7, 2023 in Gaza, that you have this civil society all across the world protesting, and yet the political leadership is not moving. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face, is how do you actually convert that kind of people's power, which is tremendous, actually. And I'm amazed and incredibly impressed with what the youth are doing all over the world, not only against conflict, but on the climate crisis. And I think we need to sort of capture that in a way to either force a change in political leadership, or if that doesn't happen, to capture what we would consider parts of the state. So, people can do quite a lot themselves in terms of development, in terms of, now you have places around the world. I can give you the example of the Kurdish communities in Syria and Iraq who have self-autonomous governments. They don't necessarily engage with the nation state. They have their own space, their own politics, their own economy, and they follow human rights principles, including gender equality and so on. And they have a theory from their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, which is actually based on the practice of the Kurdish struggle in Iraq and Syria, but also in some ways in Turkey and Iran. So I think we need to, and unfortunately the media has been a colossal failure in the last years, particularly the mainstream Western media. The media doesn't focus on these kinds of issues. And I think we need to not only participate in these movements and efforts that are being made, but we also need to put out, whether it's social media, the positive struggles that are taking place all over the world.
Thank you. Irene, would you like to react to that?
I think, Miloon, you've pointed out something very important. That is the disconnect between democracy, the democratic institutions, the political institutions are based on democracy, and what people actually want. And you're talking about the Palestine protests that are happening. Think, for example, in the US, where public opinion shows time and time again that people are actually in favor of a woman's right to safe abortion. But what do the political institutions do? So you have this sort of disconnect between democracy and human rights in that way, which is a very big danger, both to human rights and to democracy, because they are interdependent. You talked about media. Well, why is media not responding? Why is media not reporting on what is happening? Because who owns media? Media is supposed to be a public good, but it's actually almost entirely owned by large companies, corporations. And they don't own the media to make a profit, because media is actually, in today's world, print media or broadcast media, they don't make money. Money has been siphoned off by the digital oligarchs. So why do they buy these media companies? Because through the media, they're actually controlling public information, they're controlling public opinion, all the, what you would call the blood running in the veins and arteries of democracy. That's what information is, really. And when that information is then influenced, then of course the body doesn't work well. So you see this sort of the right to information. For me, the reason why I love my mandate is because I really feel it's at the center of the human rights family of human rights, because it cuts across economic and social rights to civil and political rights, from education to election to employment. You need information, you need freedom of expression. But that has been captured. So when you capture that, you destroy democracy. I think Miloon is also right that there's a lot happening at the level of the communities that we don't pay attention to, because what has actually happened, people are inventive. Human beings are really inventive and creative. What they cannot get at the center, they find in their own villages. And that is what's happening. You see wonderful, inspiring stories of people doing things in their own communities, young women setting up businesses, young movements of indigenous people, of those who are working in the area of the environment for now, trying to turn things around, do things in a different way. We've seen the microfinance movement, how that has really empowered so many women to come forward in the economy and to build new lives. All those things are happening, but then at the end of the day, you need the framework, you need the structure, you need to connect, because individual communities cannot provide security, they cannot provide communication across nations, and for that you need government, and that is where the rot is. And what I see now, the uprising of young people, that's a protest, because they got education, they don't have employment. They have hopes and aspirations, they don't have a means of actually turning them into reality. So they are going out on the streets, they are protesting, but unfortunately, again, the protest can only go so far. What comes after? And that is where we kind of need to really rethink the way in which we organize ourselves now. And I think there are things happening, but they're happening in a very fragmented way. And we have a very small window of opportunity to do something before the planet is blown up by these people. So that is why I am, yes, I am perhaps pessimistic, because I see in my work the way in which states that are supposed to protect rights don't do it. Companies that are supposed to respect rights don't do it, and they get away with it. I also see the civil movements, civil society, but I do think that we have to reach out to each other. And one of the big mistakes that we have made as human rights activists, and I say that as having led one of the world's largest human rights activist movement, Amnesty International, is that we have a language that others don't understand. Social movements, we believe that the land rights movement and other kinds of peasants' movements, the work that they're doing, we see it and we say, but that is human rights work. But they don't believe they're doing human rights work. And why? because human rights is apolitical. It was born apolitical. We've never looked at systems. We have looked at rights, we have looked at individuals, we have looked at group rights, but we've never looked at institutions and systems. Big mistake.
Miloon, would you like to pick on some of the points that Irene just made?
Yeah, I mean, to continue on my optimistic line, this is going well because we're sort of... I know it's very difficult these days when we see the horrors in Gaza and Sudan and elsewhere to look ahead. But one of the sort of positive dimensions that has come out of all these horrors is that people have realized the double standards with which their governments work. People have realized that their leaders are not in touch with the reality on the ground. And I see in the coming cycles of elections, whether it's in Western European countries or it's the midterm elections coming up in the United States, I think there's going to be a fundamental shift away from either the right wing or the authoritarian parties to perhaps more center or maybe even center-left. And I think there's an opportunity there in the coming months and years where if, good leadership takes over, there can be a collaboration between those people, and some of them might even come from the social movements that are out there today, and ordinary people, and who can meet, that they can meet these aspirations. So I think we have to, just like it's very important for us to look back in history and try to understand where we are today, and in a way history is repeating itself in many ways, but we also need to look ahead. And we have to look ahead because the whole sort of lives of future generations are at stake, particularly with the climate crisis and the growing sort of conflict issues. So I think there is a political change coming, and we need to anticipate that, and we need to be prepared to contribute in that process.
Thanks, Miloon and Irene. I'd like now to open the floor for some questions, comments, experience sharing, if anyone would like to start. Or maybe as you might prepare some... Oh, sorry, I haven't seen you. Yes. I'm waiting for the mic. Yeah, thanks. Can you please just introduce briefly yourself?
Yes, my name is Roman. I am a first-year international history politics student from the United States. My question is for Madame Khan. You said social movements have a language that the average person doesn't understand, and I think this reflects truly a big failure of the left in the United States, that a lot of what is said is couched in this academic, very heady framing that, people from where I'm from in rural California don't understand and can't connect with, and so they feel isolated from these movements. So my question is, how do we reconnect these two parties? How do we change into a framing that people can understand, that isn't so, I guess for lack of a better word, elitist?
Yeah. I'm teaching currently here a course on human rights and development. And the reason why I'm teaching the two, and I do a lot of comparative work as we go through the classes, is because I believe that both sides have something to offer. The problem, I have devoted my whole life to human rights, so I can criticize it, because I understand it, I love it, and I know also what its weaknesses are. We in the human rights system don't look at reality very much. It's an ideal system, so we're fighting for the ideal. We need to be optimistic. We're all hope mongers. That's good. But when you bring it down, and how am I going to convince the farmer in California that it really matters to him? I have to talk about the things that matter to him. About the way his plants may be flourishing or not flourishing because there's not enough water. There is a right to water. What does that right to water mean for him in California? So you have to come down to that reality, and I think development people are good at doing that. They're not good at thinking in terms of rights. They will think of the water, but they won't think about that he has a right to water. So bringing those kinds of different ideologies together, I think we learn a lot from that. I'm not sure that just relying on political parties will bring about change. I think people have to get worked up. Look at Gaza and what has happened. It's been going on for 2 years. The politicians knew right from the beginning what was going to happen at the end, and they didn't move. It was only when news seeped down, ordinary people and people in Gaza using their smartphones and so on, everyone became almost a journalist there. And the information getting out, that moving, getting people out on the roads, on the streets. But tomorrow, as soon as the ceasefire will be into place, people will forget it. So we've got to keep the human rights story very relevant with what is actually happening. People have to understand that human rights is a system for controlling power. And that is why we have to use it for accountability purpose, is in very real, concrete ways. And at the moment, I think there is a sort of a fragmented approach to these issues. And we need to also, I'm a lawyer. I think, Miloon, you are too. No, you're not. Well, I am a lawyer, actually. And I say so, and that's why I believe that the language of the law is a very difficult one. And you start talking about human rights, and it's a rights framework, and there's an obligation and a duty, and so on and so forth, and you lose the people right away. But if you look at the objective, where are we going? What do we actually want? We want justice. When I was in Amnesty, we did a street survey of the public, and we went out and we asked them whether they understood human rights. 80% of the people in the streets of London don't understand it. But when we said, do you know what justice is? Yes. They give you examples right away. I've done it actually in Darfur, in one of the refugee camps. Rights? No. Justice? Yes. So that's the common language. So maybe we need to convert those things into looking at what is it that we want at the end of the day, rather than using our legal language to get there. And start, talking to people and listening to people. Listening is very important, as you said. We have to listen to those farmers in California and ask them, why do you not vote for human rights? Why do you vote for the other side?
Miloon, would you like to expand on your own experience and your own take on the importance of bringing those ideas in different ways, in different languages, in order to have human rights really speaking to people? And how do grassroots movements themselves use this language or not, according to you?
Well, I just want to respond to Irene quickly. Actually, Irene, all the decades I've worked on human rights, I've been many, many times happy that I'm not a lawyer. Because there are different ways of looking at human rights, and you're right. Even in India we say social justice, we don't use, but it's not only to be handled by lawyers. But I also think that it's not really true that the human rights movements, bodies, instruments are not in touch with reality. Just look at the example of the cross-cultural tremendous movement on peasants' rights, right? Which started at the grassroots and ended up with a UN declaration on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. And now there's a working group on the rights of peasants. There's a new instrument being drafted to check the power of, this is a covenant, legally binding instrument to check the power of transnational corporations. There's been tremendous work done on recognizing the right to water and the right to a healthy environment. So I think one of the strengths of the movement, and this is largely what happens here at the Human Rights Council and in the work of the rapporteurs and treaty bodies, is that there is an attempt, and a successful attempt, to keep up with the new challenges that come from the ground. And I think there's another dimension which is really important, and this is partly to respond to your question, is, human rights can only really work if there is autonomy, if there is decentralization. So I think the role, and this is being recognized now, the role of local authorities, local institutions, municipalities, local councils in rural areas is really, really important. That we have to stress that role. We have to, learn from them. I can tell you from my own country, we have maybe hundreds of tribal movements that are based on the Gram Sabha, which is the local council concept, who are now, because of there's been a grassroots movement and also because of national laws, are able to actually decide for themselves whether a development project should go ahead or not. So they have a right. They have a right to consent, and this is a legal. And actually, this is a fantastic instrument, because even in places where you don't have local councils, a local council has to be created before any project can go ahead, right? So there's the power of local authorities has to be stressed, because if we only leave things in the hands of national bodies, you can see what is happening around the world. And I see even in the United States, you have so many cities who have adopted human rights instruments that even the UN, even the US has not ratified. You have so many, local movements who are challenging President Trump, right, and what he's trying to do. So I think human rights are very powerful, and I keep making this point that we have to not get lost in what's happening all over the world, but to focus at the local level, wherever we.
In fact, Miloon, I do agree with you on that point. And if you look at the Universal Declaration, Eleanor Roosevelt played a big role in it. And she has this famous line about where will human rights really matter, and it will be in the small houses and villages and hamlets and so on. And it is there that human rights come into contact with the economy, with society, with community, with customs, with cultures, and then becomes real in people's lives. As a special rapporteur, I have a lot of things to do. One is to write reports, as you were saying. But the really useful thing that I do as a special rapporteur is when I visit countries, because there I'm in contact with people. There, actually, I see things happening. So this is about making human rights real, and this is what I meant, that human rights is lost in these legal instruments, and it's not the declaration. With all due respect, the declaration is the end product. And it may or may not mean very much for people. It may be very useful for policymakers, but not for the people. But it's actually on the ground, and that's where we have to. Human rights movement, social movements, nowadays they're learning. We're learning. We're working together more and more, and that's where the real change is coming.
Yes, there is a question in the back, yeah.
Hello. I just have one question, because I feel if you look at Morocco, for example, there's this big Gen Z protests, and they say we want hospitals and not football stadiums. And there's this new means that people can anonymously exchange in online forums without giving their names. There's protests, they're allowed in the streets also, but somehow people are now more and more saying the Arab Spring was like a flame coming up, and now it's back into the ashes. They interviewed the Prime Minister. The king seems to be so far spared, but the politicians are saying one thing up there, and so many people are out of jobs. They're demonstrating, but there doesn't seem to be a link between what the young people are wanting or things they want to change, and the government saying, yes, we see what we can do. It will lead to a kind of a revolution, but there doesn't seem to be a link between the two stratospheres. So what to do in a certain way? That's my question. Thank you.
Irene?
I have the answer to that one.
What to do and how to favor, how to promote those connections? Would you?
Well, the other, it's not vertical anymore, the connection. The people in the power and the people on the streets are thinking very differently. But people on the streets of Morocco and the people on the streets of Kathmandu have something in common. So you see this horizontal linkage across people. And you've seen that catch fire in the context of Palestine, because there was something very concrete. So when there were protests in Rome, there were protests in London, there were protests in other parts of the world, in the Arab world, and so on. People connected. So now what you're seeing is, on one side, the horizontal connection. And that is where I would say digital technology has been very useful. Obviously, the manipulation part is there, but that horizontal connection is also there, and that is why it's easier to organize. But organizing in itself does not produce results. Organizing is an expression, a demand. And when the demand, you know what the basic economics of demand and supply. The demand is there, the supply is behind. And whenever that happens, somewhere someone else thinks there's an opportunity here for me to produce a product that this supplier is not producing. And there it is both good and it's bad. The good side is that there will be new kinds of political movements that are coming up now. We see that with young people, in my own country, the students who did the uprising last year, now they're trying to form political parties. Of course, they're fumbling, they're making mistakes. They probably won't win very many seats now, but step by step, they will learn. So new things are happening, but also dangerous things. Because others, whenever you create a vacuum of power, then obviously all kinds of dark forces can move in. So that is why we need to be alert. It's not about being pessimistic, it's about being realistic. And at the same time, idealistic. So yes, you hold your ideals, but you have to move in a very realistic way. And that is where I think today, more than ever, ordinary people have the power to do extraordinary things. And that's why you see this flotilla going now, and they know they will not get to Gaza. The second flotilla has also been stopped, but they're still doing it because they want to make a mark. And if and young people are getting roused now, and they will learn, just as we learned in our times, how to fight those battles, and we've got to support them, and we've got to kind of push them forward, and this horizontal connection has to grow. Because I don't think it's about up and down anymore. They're not listening at the top. But if enough people at the bottom can join up, then, of course, you create a new top, a new different kind of a top.
I'm trying to remember the name of the person who said this, but in India, an eminent scholar once said that when the superpower crumbles or collapses, the grassroots will rise. And I think this is what we see happening. And this question that was Cindy about the protests against corruption in Morocco, and this contrast between the money going into the state football stadium and what the people are needing, has actually, as Irene said, it's now really catching on. We see it in Philippines, we see it in Bangladesh, we see it in Nepal. And I think one of the reasons this has happened is because, again, I go back to the Gaza experience, because people have seen that they can go out there and protest. They can go out there in the thousands, and some of the protests have been 1 million people on the streets. And so that is the way, even in countries that are very authoritarian, people can go out on the streets and protest. And I think that's a very positive dimension. So I keep using this phrase, civil disobedience, which Mahatma Gandhi and many other people, used successfully. And I think what we need to do is to understand those movements, connect with them, work with them wherever we can, join them where we can. I'm always telling young people, go out. There's so many protests going on. Go out there and join. Don't miss your classes, those of you who are here from the Institute. But there's a lot happening out there which eventually I think will end up in, whether it's positive, progressive local governments, or it's social movements that are doing a lot on their own. So I think the key is to not be disillusioned, not be pessimistic, not be, sarcastic about everything. The key is to really join and understand the positive things that are happening. And the kinds of protests we see around the world today on different issues, climate, conflict, now corruption, are unprecedented. I mean, I don't remember a time in the last decades when we had, you have an entire country in Italy shut down because the people are completely, upset about Gaza. So I think there's a kind of a fervor on the ground which I think is positive and which we need to engage with. And I agree with Irene that there's so many horizontal advances that can be made. We shouldn't get lost with just, the president or the prime minister is crazy, There's a lot of leaders at the local level who are trying to, to have positive impacts. I mean, I can give you the example of Italy. So, the president is, who she is. But I know from working with groups that in many local municipalities, a lot of really progressive things are happening, even when the top leadership is, whatever you call it, right-wing, So.
Thanks. We would have time for one question, but let's expand and take the three, and then you can make the final comments. The first question was there, and then we have, 1, 2, 3. So everyone can make a brief question, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. My question is about the impact of the war over in Gaza on the United Nations human rights regime. Thank you.
And then if you could, pass on the mic to the other side. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe just very briefly, 2 quick questions. One I'm curious about the role of the nation state in protecting the rights of people on the move. So refugees, asylum seekers, and I think increasingly authoritarian right-wing regimes are using the rhetoric of protecting the rights of citizens. So I'm just curious about what is the rights of people on the move, and who holds that. And very quickly on the second one, as we sort of considering our economies, markets, financial systems are increasingly interconnected, and you have green protectionist measures like trade tariffs and the EU's CBAM, and rights of different people sort of rub up against each other in different ways. So you're thinking about the rights of your domestic industries and the workers in those domestic industries, but also people are losing jobs in other parts of the world because of trade and protectionist measures. So I'm just curious about how institutions today are thinking about transnational rights, and when rights rub up against each other uncomfortably, how do you resolve that?
Thanks. And just in front. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Kaya. I'm from Canada. Just a question quickly. Canada promotes itself as this bastion and upholder of human rights. But being from there and from the family that I'm from, I know personally that that's not the case. And you spoke earlier about justice. Canada has mechanisms to use human rights, I guess that framework, to hold power to account, as you say. Yet, when we do that, we don't see any justice. And so a country like Canada that claims to uphold human rights, and they point fingers at other countries here in Geneva for their breaches, yet some of theirs are really egregious. I guess my question is, that framework is there, it's implemented there, but yet it isn't working from my perspective. What would you suggest? How would you suggest we move forward with a framework like human rights to hold a country like Canada to account to its obligations?
Thank you. And there was a last question, I think, here in the front, right? Yes. Oh, okay. So, yeah, very briefly, please, and then here. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering what you think about other forms of societies, organizations that are coming up, like people's assemblies, because these are not necessarily social movements that kind of drain out, because social movements take resources and a lot of energy. And these hybrid kind of organizations where the government is kind of involved in organizing these people's assemblies, and these people's assemblies may also last longer than kind of a political term. So I was just wondering if you have interesting examples on what you think of these new hybrid forms.
Thanks for all the questions and also all the issue areas and issues that you have pointed to in your questions. So I would leave Irene and Miloon to make a few concluding points, also based on what has been asked by the different members of the audience.
Well, there was this very broad question on how the crisis in Palestine has affected the UN human rights regime. I think we have to ask the question in a different way. It's like, how has the UN system responded to what is happening in Palestine? It's not as if a crisis at a particular level is going to fundamentally change the structures of the UN. And in that, a lot has happened, as you know. There are a lot of different bodies. We have this fantastic Special Rapporteur, Francesca. We have, different other rapporteurs who are also responding on Palestine. I don't think we've seen a time like this where you have, I would say almost dozens of rapporteurs who are focusing on Palestine from all different dimensions. You have the Commission of Inquiry. So, the UN is, in a way, doing what it can. There is a bit of an issue with different parts of the UN system. Irene and I sort of come from what is called the independent part of the system. But there's formal parts of the system. So, for example, you have a Secretary General's Special Representative in New York on genocide who hasn't done anything. I mean, we're supposed to be preventing genocide. So there are different parts of the UN system. But I think, the UN has done what it can, but where obviously there needs to be more progress is to convince states to go beyond just statements, to actually have sanctions, have diplomatic censure, and that is where the UN has not been very effective. And that's a general point that I can make, because as Irene was, I think, mentioning at the beginning, the decisions are now being made not at the UN, but in bilateral ways, in other ways. And that's where we need to get the UN back into, that it gets back into play. People's assemblies, just very quickly, I think it fits into what I was saying before, that you have to have a non-state process. I mean, you can have a hybrid process as well. Again, I go back to the Kurdish question. So, for example, the Kurdish struggle in Kurdistan in Iraq actually is part of the national government, but they have their own self-autonomous region, right? So it's a kind of a hybrid system. So the national government in Iraq recognizes the rights and the struggle of the Kurdish people. And you have other examples like that. I don't see an issue with that. The issue that happens is when you have, so for example, I was giving you the example of the tribal communities councils in India. There's sometimes an attempt made to capture part of that council or to create a conflict within the groups, and that's a difficult situation that has to be handled. So people's assemblies, yeah, we need more of them. And I think when we see forces like the World Social Forum and others, where you have, which is very positive because you have across the continents and across countries a collaboration towards a better world, right? Maybe you could take some. I don't know if this.
Okay. Let me start with Palestine. The UN to the world at large looks like one homogeneous entity, but it isn't. There are large parts of it that are member states. So the UN Security Council, totally paralyzed. UN General Assembly, is pushing out things but doesn't have the power to do very much. And then you have, of course, the Secretariat and the entities and independent experts like us. UNRWA, several hundred UNRWA staff have been killed in Gaza. So the UN staff have also paid a very heavy price there. UNRWA, as you know, has been effectively banned by Israel. A lot of other UN agencies are trying to get in. Some are managing to help or get in and are absolutely horrified, and hopefully they're all waiting to get in and do something. On the human rights side, you mentioned Francesca Albanese, and the Special Rapporteurs. I think all of us have been very active on Palestine. About a year ago, I think it was in March last year, that we put out the first statement talking about unfolding of genocide, because we could see the signs out there already. In March last year, our first joint statement talked about genocide. So we were ringing the alarm bells. We are, of course, individuals. We cannot do very much physically ourselves, but we were certainly all ringing the bells out there, and finally the world has heard. There's still a long way to go, so let's see what happens down there. But different parts of the UN are working at different speeds. The further away we are from member states, the better the UN is performing, if I can say so. Rights of people on the move, refugees, the Refugee Convention. I worked for UNHCR for 20 years, and the Refugee Convention came long before the human rights conventions came in the UN system. So, of course, internationally, everyone recognized the vulnerable situation in which people on the move are. Unfortunately, on the other side, on the political side, this sort of nationalism, ultranationalism, Zionism, xenophobic tendencies have been coming out, and that has, of course, been very, very damaging for people on the move. I think this is going to be one of the big challenges for developed countries, how you manage your borders. Who do you let in? The whole idea, the whole concept of asylum, I mean, exists for as long as I think humanity exists. Always the notion that there are some people who will have to flee and others in solidarity will have to protect them. So I think the countries today that are, in fact, if you look at, in UNHCR, we always used to say that the poorest countries are carrying the heaviest burden of asylum. Usually countries in Africa, those are next to big war situations, refugees come in. My own country, Bangladesh, produced 10 million refugees in 1971, went to India. People were not pushed back, but there are smaller numbers coming here, and you see the situation here. So I think there's a lot of work to be done by civil society, by ordinary voters, people, to understand how important it is to give protection to those who are fleeing persecution. But equally, how important it is for our modern economies to have migration. Migratory labor is very useful. They're finding it out in the US, where a number of industries are now suffering because of this ICE policy of throwing irregular migrants out. So I think this whole area of migration, that is, like human rights, a critical area for us to look at now as policymakers, policy thinkers, and to create a fair and just system that benefits all. That takes me to the other question that was asked about how conflicting rights. You protect domestic workers, but others lose their job abroad. You know, when the system of globalization was working well, and there was a period of time when everyone talked about the globalized economy, the supply chains, and so on. The idea was that everyone would benefit from it. All boats would rise. Unfortunately, the water went up. Boats did rise, but only some did, and some sank. So the benefits, the fruits of globalization were not shared. But the idea that we all live in a world where we are joined is probably the right idea. But the way in which it was implemented, where some people became richer and others became poorer, and that led to discontent, and that is what we are paying for now, where, again, we're going back to this, what do you call it, this sort of extreme idea of closing your borders and just taking care of yourself. But at the end of the day, we'll only survive through solidarity. Humanity will only survive through solidarity, whether it's the planet, whether it's our jobs, whether it's, whichever way we look at it. And those fundamental values, I think we have to keep working at it. I think you talked about Canada. It's not a perfect country, far from it. But, as I said earlier, human rights are an ideal. So you have to constantly work at it. And we, all of us, have to do our best, push from one generation to the next, and encourage where we see a good ideas, good thinking coming out, with the idea that we've all got to rise at the same time. All boats have to rise at the same time, otherwise it doesn't work. Underpinning international human rights is international solidarity.
Thank you very much. Also on making this call for action.
Sorry, can I just quickly respond to Kaya's question? I think, you come from a First Nations community, right? And there's quite a lot of movements within those communities. And actually, over the years, I've seen how your colleagues and your leaders and your chiefs have actually used the UN system, whether there's the visits of the rapporteurs or its recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review, or actually making complaints to the UN treaty bodies. So, if the intergovernmental part of the UN has not responded well in holding Canada accountable, you have this whole other system, right, which can be very, very useful for your struggle. And that other system, whether it's rapporteurs, treaty bodies, other bodies, it is based on the same instruments, right? All of us are working with the same instruments, and that's the basis of our work, right? So I think just to continue on that would be the way to go, right?
Thank you. So I think on this also call for action and indications on how different mechanisms, spaces can be leveraged. We have a lot of also of food for thought and also of spaces probably for action. And I also I'm thinking about what you said earlier about being both realistic and idealistic. I think this is also a very productive way to think about this whole questions that we have been exploring today. So thank you very much for being with us, and please join me in thanking warmly our two guest speakers. Have a good afternoon, and we have another event tonight, which is titled Remapping Political Power in India, which will take place in the nearby room at 6:30. Thanks, and see you soon.